Hello, and welcome to another episode of Progressive West Texas, the show where we talk to leaders who are trying to create positive change in our community. Today, we are talking to another school board candidate for Lubbock ISD. His name is Dr. Jason Rinaldo, and he is running for District 3. He is a counselor, a professor at Texas Tech, and he worked in the prison system. So after we talked to him about his campaign and what he wants to do once he's elected to school board, we are then joined by Dr. Janis Henderson and Kevin Word, who are both advocates for prison reentry reform. So there's a lot of reform that needs to happen in our justice system, in our prison system. But today we focus on how to better integrate people into society after they have served their sentence. Right now, it is still really tough to live a normal life after you've served time for a felony. And so we talk about what needs to happen to make that easier and make people welcome into society again. So it's a really good show. This group is passionate about what they are talking about. So we talk a little bit longer than some of the previous episodes. I hope you stick around. Now let's go meet Jason Rinaldo. Hi, Jason. How are you? Thanks so much for being on.
Absolutely. Thanks, Cannon, for having me on.
No problem. So how's the campaign going?
Campaign is very lively right now. We're getting into the last 2.5 weeks, and so things are really picking up. I personally suspect that the last couple of weeks are when folks really start paying attention, and maybe folks that I spoke to a month ago no longer remember my name, and so I've got to do the work of getting them to remember me now.
Yes, that name recognition is very important and sometimes frustratingly hard to get people to do. So yeah, but I think you're right. And early voting, I had to check my phone to make sure I knew what date today was. But early voting starts Monday.
It's time.
Yeah, it's time to make that decision. So Jason, tell us what, because you are running in a specific district in Lubbock
Right.
ISD. So
That's right.
tell us what that district is and
Yep.
why you decided to run for that office.
Sure. Well, first of all, to viewers, my district is between Quaker and Frankfurt in Lubbock, from Marcia Sharp south down to 98th Street. So it's a sort of tidy little trapezoidal box
Hmm.
that people can identify whether they fit into fairly easily, I hope. And what got me into it was actually, um, well, throughout COVID, I'm going to go back to some precursors now. Throughout COVID, my son kept telling me things like, "Oh, I don't want to go to school." And I thought that that was normal, typical teenager, I don't want to go to school stuff. And he would say things like, "We only have had substitutes for the last 2 weeks. We're not learning anything anyway." And I wish in retrospect that I had taken that a little bit more seriously because it turns out he was literally telling the truth. I thought he meant he has more substitutes than usual or something like that,
Hmm.
but he meant it literally. And that was sort of an early warning that things weren't going as planned. Um, and then I heard a little bit more when Dupree closed. A whole lot of friends took notice of that and said, "I cannot believe they just closed the school with minimal engagement with the public over shutting down a historic elementary school." And and then I was encouraged to run by folks who thought that my qualifications fit.
Hmm.
So I
Yeah.
did. And then now I've got a sort of head of steam, if you will. As I
Hmm.
learn more about what's going on in the district, I become increasingly horrified and alarmed, and I have all new reasons to be running.
Hmm. Yes. Yeah. The more you dig in, the more issues there are. And so for anybody that either is not in Lubbock or just haven't heard, I've seen people online talk about not having heard about Dupree. So Dupree is the first school in LISD. Like, it was our first school, and it is supposed to be shut down at the end of the school year. And that is one of many school closures we've had over the last 5-6 years. And so yeah, and a little bit of backstory on that: teachers were told specifically that Dupree was not going to close. Then in the middle of the school year, they were told, "Oh wait, nope, we are going to close it, and there's nothing you can do about it." And so if new school board members come in, there is a possibility of that being reversed if we make a change to that leadership. So tell me, What are some of the most important issues facing LISD today?
There's a multitude of them. So structurally, if we start with the numbers for sort of an overview, the two key issues are the loss of 1,100 students per year
Mhm.
to outlying districts. And for those who might not know about school funding, the number of butts in seats, if you will, of kids in second period is how much schools get funding. And so when you're losing 1,100 students a year for our district, that's about 4%. And anybody who's been up close and personal with the budget of an organization knows that you can't do a 4% loss per year for several years without absolute catastrophe. So that's one side of it.
Mhm.
And then way out of pace with that 4% attrition is our attrition of teachers. That is in the ballpark of 250 teachers a year,
Mhm.
which is drastically outpacing the loss of students.
Mhm.
And that is an early warning sign that, well, it's a late warning sign that there's some very substantial problems running off our absolutely fundamental, most core, key, competent professionals who make the school system run. Like without them, it's like removing the engine from a car. You don't
Mhm.
really have a car anymore. You just have a shell. So losing that that might be roughly 19% is a reasonable estimate of how many teachers you're losing a year. And for
Mhm.
folks who have managed an organization, that level of turnover is almost always indicative of some managerial level problems, some
Mhm.
fundamental structural problems. And so we've had these red flags going now for a while, and yet our community is largely unaware of the crisis level issues that the
Right.
district faces.
Now, why do you think the community is unaware? Is that on the community side, or is that a communications issue on the leadership side?
I see that as a fundamental communication issue. I have a fairly strong disagreement with our current board members on that issue.
Mhm.
It's not the case that parents are sitting on their couches and waiting to get involved. By definition, if the community doesn't know about what's going on, you have communicated poorly.
Mhm.
It's not up to them to somehow know that it's time to listen. So it's entirely incumbent upon the district to communicate effectively to let people know, hey, we are in an unusual circumstance that we need help with.
Mhm.
And this is an all hands on deck situation that generally nobody's aware of. And that's
Mhm.
a catastrophic level failure of leadership.
Yeah. So when you're in office, what would you do differently to improve that communication?
So, as I gather information now about the school district, our primary methods of communication are things like Twitter and our website and things like that
Mhm.
that are more or less passive. You have to go and seek
Mhm.
those sources for that information to come to you. Um, for example, I get texts and emails from my son's school uh, very regularly, but they're things about signing up for yearbook and remembering that you can't park on one side of the school because of construction next week, and
Mhm.
things that are more or less incidental. There's no actual channel of actively pushing information out to parents about the key issues in the district.
Mhm.
You know, the fact that we have a pep rally next week is not a fundamental issue for the district. And so that's not a communication channel. We need active communication, including things that might involve advertising if necessary, like
Mhm.
actively saying we need a spot in the AJ on a regular basis. We need
Mhm.
television programming to push this out. We need a spot in the news on a regular weekly basis to communicate to people, here's what's going on with the district.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, that seems simple. And I think the other thing too is when you get used to getting non-important information via text, you then eventually stop paying
Right.
attention to it as much. So then when something is important, so it seems like those important aspects need to be the ones that are pushed out. And we're kind of doing that the opposite way. So you reposted an interview that one of our current school board members did. And there was something very interesting about this interview because this was when you used the phrase, I don't know if you could hear that motorcycle passing, but I couldn't hear myself. Um, so you used the phrase they're just sitting on the couches, which is what this current sitting school board member said about the parents that he supposedly represents. But one of the interesting things about that is the discussion started with talking about what time the school board meetings are, because they're very early in the morning, and it makes it difficult for people to show up and then get to work, or for teachers to show up and then get to their schools. Now, if they are asked to come and present at the school board, then they're given some leeway because their principals know why they're showing up late.
Right.
It doesn't work that cleanly if they're just trying to attend or express something in the public comments. But one of the things that this current school board member says, he said, which they've always done in the morning for the last 4 or 5 years at least. So they have not changed their meeting times to see if people showed up. But he said, well, we've done other things in the morning or at lunch or in the afternoon, and people never show up. And that leaves out a very important time, which is in the evenings.
Right. So in other words, we've tried when people are working in the morning, we've tried around their lunch hour, and we've tried in the afternoons when they're at work. And we don't know why people who are working can't show up to these meetings. Right. It could be because they're working. That really could be a possibility that needs to be considered. And 7 a.m. for all of those folks who are probably the most invested in the school district, that's the time you're getting your kids up, showered and dressed and fed, and then getting them to school so you can get to work on time so you can stay employed. That's a really important time. Not a good time to go off and have a meeting and have coffee with friends or any other leisure type activity. Like, you need time that is set aside that's available to the largest portion of people. And that's not in the morning. It's not during the working day. It's not like this is a calculus level problem.
Right. Well, and it just seems to be maybe a little bit of detachment from what most of our citizens experience. I have mentioned that in a school board meeting, this was a couple of years ago, but it was largely the same members. Somebody acted like our buses were a luxury for lazy parents who just didn't want to take their kids to school. Yeah. And so how do you feel like that kind of lack of understanding by our current school board members, how does that affect the decisions they're making?
Well, that particular thing about how buses are just a luxury and parents should be willing to drive their kids to wherever they need, that's a sort of charter school mentality where you can take your kid to any school that you choose, so long as you have the free time to drive across town and to bus your children around to and from school before and after school, which are working hours for most folks, and then to extracurriculars, etc. That is the mentality of somebody with a lot of extra resources who hasn't had the kind of constraints on their time and resources that the average person has.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to transition a little bit, and you have worked in your studies and your academic careers. You have worked in the prison system, and when we bring our other guests on the show, we're going to have a larger discussion about prison reform and specifically introducing people back into society. But I wanted to ask you first, what are some of the lessons that you've learned from that work that you feel apply to your this position as a school board member?
Yeah. A fundamental thing that I learned in training as a psychologist that really hit home and was thoroughly persuasive in the prison setting is that people do what they are able to do, what they can do. If you approach understanding the human dynamics with the assumption that people are bad and lazy, then you're going to fail at understanding people, because typically it's not that they're bad and lazy, it's that they're doing what they know how to do and what they've got the skills to do in the vast majority of cases. And if you want to understand people, you're going to have to not just blame them for a problem that's perceived and then walk away as if that's it.
Right. Yeah. Well, thinking about that, let's bring on our other two guests, Dr. Janis Henderson and Kevin Word.
Hello.
How are y'all?
Hi.
I appreciate y'all being on, and I am looking forward to our conversation. But before we jump into that, I always like to start by asking my guests what they actually like about Lubbock in West Texas. So often, especially on TikTok, when I talk about West Texas, and I, especially when I criticize it, which I do quite a bit, people like to say, well, just move. And I'm like, well, I did, and I came back, and then I moved again, and I came back. And one thing I learned is after having lived in 3 other states, in other cities in Texas, I really like Lubbock. There's a reason I keep coming back. So I like to start by asking people what they actually like about the area. So Jason, since you're warmed up, I'll let you go first. What do you like about Lubbock in West Texas?
I always get a kick out of this one, especially right now as we have a howling wind and pounds of pollen in the air. I like the weather. And I mean, I know that sounds like I have a little bit of a problem of some kind, but in fact, Lubbock is sunny almost all the time and usually has a milder breeze than what we have right now. And so it's just like Southern California without the high rents and the water.
I feel like there might be some Southern California people that would disagree.
They might disagree, but I've had a Subaru for a decade or so, and having the top open or having a convertible or a motorcycle or anything, this is a beautiful place to have your top down in when driving.
Well, and you bring that up. That was something that I didn't think about till I moved to upstate New York, and talked about how long our cars last down here.
Right.
And when you live in hill country, when you live in the mountains, like they're gonna roll out. When everything's flat, our cars can last quite a while. So yeah, I got my car inspected yesterday and was like, I forgot that is over 10 years old. Still works great, so why not? So yeah. I understand where you're coming from.
That's part of it. And then another is that I like that I live all the way across town from the airport, and that makes it a 15-minute drive. It's so easy to get around. It's magnificent.
Of course, that is very true, yeah.
We have highways for a city of 1 million.
Right. And I was going to say, the area of New York I was in, it had a similar population size to Lubbock, but because of geography, you couldn't get around in 15 minutes because you were driving around hills and rivers, and you had to go to the bridge. And I never, that was something that was new to me. It was like, oh yeah, some places have things other than flatness. Like there are things there. So, but Kevin, what about you? What do you like about our area?
Well, for me, it's probably the two biggest are the people. There's something to be said about when we say West Texas charm. It's a real thing. The people are genuinely nice for the most part. I'd say probably 99% of the parts. Easy to get along with, very cordial, accepting. So I love that part of it. And then the other part, after having lived in New Orleans for a couple of years, is there's some food you're going to miss. And so for me, I'm a big old guy. So, Tex-Mex, barbecue, and a big old steak. Not that seafood or New Orleans doesn't have a good flavor or anything like that. But after a while, Tex-Mex and barbecue and big old steaks with good, happy, nice people.
Right. Yeah, again, when I first moved, I never thought, when people asked me, what do you miss? My first thing I said was roses, which, I never thought I'd say that. And my friends up there, they were like, but we got Taco Bell. I was like, no. This is different. This is not. So that's great. Dr. Henderson, what about you?
So I ended up back in Lubbock for an extended visit when the quarantine hit. And I just stayed with my boys for what I thought was going to be a short while. But I started finding myself thinking, maybe I want to come back home, because Lubbock really just does have that sense of being a community. People that you don't know, that you see in the store, chit chat with you. Having lived in Austin, I've moved to Austin twice, and now I guess back again twice. Having lived in Austin, it's a friendly place, and also the food there is equally as good as Lubbock. But there's just this sense of small town, hometown feel that I had forgotten existed in Lubbock, and I've really re-engaged so easily into the Lubbock community, and I had forgotten how important that is to me. Because I've always been involved with something. Used to be it was with my kids' stuff. Now that they're grown, I pursue my own interest, but I've just always been involved in something, and it's so easy to do in Lubbock.
Yeah, absolutely. I experienced that too. Yeah, as someone who moved, came back, moved, I really fell back in quite easily. So Lubbock is, and that's what I tend to tell people is, in Lubbock, you have to search for things. You have to search what you're interested for a little bit more than like Austin, where it's like, here's the live music, here's this, and it's kind of in your face. Lubbock, you got to know where to look, but it's there. We have those communities. Absolutely. Great. Well, I really appreciate that. Like I said, it's easy to be negative. It's easy to give that criticism. So I like to show people that there are reasons we're out here in West Texas. So let's get on to our topic and talk about the prison system in our state and that transition back into the community. And so, Janis, I'm going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about your advocacy work in this area and how you got started in it.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity for us to address this really important issue. It's an important societal issue, but it's also important to me personally. And I have gotten involved in advocacy. It was easy to do in Austin because there were so many different opportunities to be involved. And I was involved with a reentry roundtable. And then I also got involved with another organization that I continue to be involved with even here in Lubbock because it's a statewide organization. It's called the Statewide Leadership Council, and they're part of the Texas Center for Justice and Equity. They just changed that name, and I have trouble remembering it, so I had to peek at my notes real quick. But that's an organization that's really centered on sustainable reentry, reintegration processes, and dismantling what we call the injustice system instead of the justice system, because it is so full of injustices. So through that, I've gotten involved with legislative reform. I've been to the Capitol and done the Capitol visits with legislators. But then there's also just little things like they do some rallies in different cities. They have not come to Lubbock yet, but now that I've permanently come back here, there's some talk about trying to do it. And those rallies involve things like doing clinics that help people that have been in the system become more educated about their rights. They might be working on education for voting rights. That just depends on the area and what the needs in that area are. But my primary advocacy efforts, I guess I would say, is stigma reduction. We really need transformative change in how society perceives people who have been part of the criminal justice system. We need change in how the person is treated. We need change, and that's part of the whole reentry issue. But we also need change in how family members are treated and how family members feel. I don't want to normalize antisocial behavior, but because of our high prison populations and our high number of people that are returned citizens, we have a lot of families that are impacted by it. And yet it is a secret. It is quiet. When my son, who I am very open about, was arrested and incarcerated at 17, when he first was starting having issues, I didn't want to tell anyone. Why would you tell anyone? And then when he was incarcerated at 17 in 2007, the stigma attached was horrible. And how do you change a system that the people who are impacted, either because they're incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, have a criminal record or have loved ones, family members, were what we call system impacted, if we won't talk about it, how are you going to change it? So that's my primary advocacy area. I work with an organization called Community Family Life Services out of Washington, D.C. It's a speakers bureau. And my whole thing is talking about changing that stigma. So thank you for this opportunity. It's very important.
Yeah, of course. And Kevin, what about you? What tell us a little more about your advocacy work and how you got into it.
Well, it's kind of an interesting story. I'm with Texans Against Civil Commitment. Civil commitment is not considered part of TDCJ. So it's not really considered prison, but it is prison. It's
Right.
post-prison confinement. And so, and no one in Texas really claims it. The Health and Human Services that monitors the budget says we don't have to do anything to do with that. TDCJ, we don't have anything to do with that. They are a standalone entity with little, if any, oversight. And so that's, anytime you don't have oversight or transparency, you're going to have problems.
Right.
And so, interestingly enough, my ex-wife, who I'm very good friends with, was a counselor and therapist at the Civil Commitment Center. And she would tell me often, this is going on, that's going on, this is, and, she was an intern and still learning practice. So, but very strong in ethics and, making sure that, clinical treatment is done the way it's intended to be done.
Mm-hmm.
To maintain her license, if nothing else. And so I started doing some research. I said, well, I'll just read about it, see if there's something that I can do. Because she was talking about starting a website. And then the more I found out about it, the more I realized that it was absolutely insane. That we were not offering clinical treatment within the facilities, the prisons themselves, that we were putting guys in prisons for 20 years that were serving their entire sentence that a judge and jury had handed down, that was, the laws have said this is the sentence that's appropriate. They had served their time, done what they're supposed to for society to pay their debt, and then they're told, oh, wait, we have more. We're going to give you, some time in confinement, 6 to 12 months, maybe 18 at the most, and we'll get you back out in the community. But you need to go through therapy because you have a mental abnormality and you've committed 2 or more crimes in sexual offenses.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that is, one, they've already served their time.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do this for any other group of convicted people. We don't do this for people that are convicted for murder, for assault, for battery, for robbery. Any other of the violent offenses, this is not done for.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the recidivism rate for sexual offenders is it's the absolute lowest except for murderers. Mm-hmm. So, this hype that the media has and everything, that these guys go out and reoffend at such high rates, is not true. We have 20 years of data that shows that. Mm-hmm. And if you paid your debt to society, okay, mandate counseling outside during their probation or for their parole. But we had an outpatient program in Texas. And over 4.77 years, the recidivism rate was less than 1%. And they shut it down and said that because no one had been released, which basically means they were out, they were living in halfway houses, they had jobs, they were working, they were in the community, but because they hadn't been released from treatment, mm-hmm. they said the program was ineffective. So let's lock them up now. And now we've locked them up since 2015 in Littlefield, Texas, in the Texas Civil Commitment Center, under the administration, the Texas Civil Commitment Office, and we've released 6 guys.
There's
it. Over 400 out there. Now,
wow.
You tell me how that's effective.
Right.
Now, the recidivism rate is 0, obviously.
Right.
But we had an effective outpatient program.
Yeah.
This is managed also by a for-profit company.
Yeah.
Why would I release anybody if I can make money off of filled beds?
Right. Yeah. Well,
And the
and
list
I
just
just
goes on and on. Sorry.
I want to make sure that this part is clear. So they are keeping 400 people in this facility who have already served their time,
Yes.
and they have only released six. So those
Right.
that everybody has served their time. They but they're still stuck in this facility.
Now, I will say, the Texas Civil Commitment Office, after our protest, we had the media out, and they said they have released 13. That is correct. They have released 13. 7 of those was because they won court cases. They
Mm,
have only released 6 that have completed this 5-tier program that has no clear guidelines.
mhm.
We have a 5-tier program, but it's indefinite. There's no clear path for release. So that's one of the things we advocate for. Give these guys timelines, dates. What is the what you have to do in each stage? We've had men, because of the turnover in the facility with caseworkers and therapists, that have waited 2 and 3 years just to be tiered up a level.
Mhm.
They've met all the requirements, but because caseworkers and therapists have come and gone at such an alarming rate, and we were
Mhm.
talking about turnover rate for teachers earlier, it's the same in this facility. The absolute the attrition rate is phenomenal. Because if people say anything about the treatment of the men that goes against what they believe, and it is they are treated like prisoners. They even have to pay for some of these guys at the lower levels have to pay for ankle monitors inside a locked facility to
Oh
monitor
wow.
their movements.
Yeah.
Now, tell me how that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. That's rough.
They
So
were
so
also paying. Go ahead.
well, Kevin, I do I want to get back to it. I wanted to bring Jason in
Yeah.
just for a second because you were talking about how Jason he has his background in counseling,
Right.
worked in some of these facilities. So, Jason, what happens to people that are supposed to be making progress but given no clear guidepost or no like is that an effective way to for treatment?
I'm not, I no longer remember all of the jokes that therapists make about court ordered treatments, but in general, I mean, the foundation of effective treatment is a therapeutic alliance between the therapist and the client.
Hmm.
And if instead a judge has said, hey, we're going to add on an indefinite amount of time to your sentence, even though you're done and you've been released, and maybe this therapist will sign off on you. I really don't know what the parameters are for a person being released, but that is a really good way to create a situation where no therapeutic alliance can be had.
Hmm.
It's a great way to ensure that no therapeutic progress can be made, at least except in rare circumstances. So it's not a setting in which you would expect great progress to be made because there are very few people who wouldn't be incredibly enraged and pissed off that they've served their sentence and then they get an additional lockup.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and let me add to that just a little bit,
yeah,
Cannon. The therapists make the recommendations for these guys to be moved up, but the case managers who have no
Mm.
background in therapeutic treatment and the board who are former criminal district attorneys or people that prosecuted offenders, or even we have a member on the board who is a sister of a victim
Mhm.
that's on this board that decides if these guys move up or not. None of the board and none of the case managers have any therapeutic experience or training, and they're the ones deciding if these guys move through the tiers, not the therapist.
I mean,
So Jason, and then I think Janice has been one to
sorry.
jump in too. So
Yeah,
so
I'm sure.
uh,
I just want to throw out the word unconstitutional because that's relevant here.
yeah.
Yes.
Some people have pretended to care about the Constitution lately, and this is a violation. This is taking away somebody's freedom without due process. It's as simple as can be. The due process happened, the punishment happened, but then they remove freedom again, more or less extrajudicially. The standard. So I think it's Hendricks v. Kansas. This also has been a while since I
It is.
do the legal literature for it, but it sets a fairly high standard of certainty that you have to have that a person is going to be a recidivist before you can lock them up to protect the public. Not just, oh, they once had a charge, but a very high probability that they're going to act again to harm the public. And I have no idea about the facility and the 400 people that are out there, but I do know the amount of psychological evaluation it takes to reach that standard being very high and also extremely hard to come by in the state of Texas. So I'm skeptical at the outset that sufficient evaluation has done to justify unconstitutionally yanking somebody's freedom from them on the chance that they may be a recidivist.
Janice, what were you going to say?
Well, and going back to the discussion about the value of a therapeutic intervention that has no goal. So I don't work from a therapeutic approach. I am an educator, and so I do family and community education. One of the very first things that we learn as students, and then that I teach and taught to my students when I taught at the university level, is the understanding of the importance of a goal and goal setting and having an end plan. And so if you have people who are there, and I'll use Jason's word, with rage over being there unfairly, or at least I would assume they think they're there unfairly. So you have the rage, and then you have that lack of a goal. A goal is what we all operate on. Think of every day how many little goals you give yourself. Like every day you give yourself the goal to get out of bed, the goal to fix your coffee. So if you have no goal, you're really kind of like a ship just lost at sea. So from a therapeutic or an education standpoint.
Well, and you mentioning education, yeah, I'm glad you did, because that's what I was thinking. Is I was going, this sounds so much like education, because they're, the standards that you have to meet are set by legislatures that have no background in education. And really, in order to get someone to learn, there has to be positive buy-in, and really it comes down to the student and the educator, teacher, professor, whoever they are. Kind of like Jason, what you were saying about that between the counselor and and the inmate, like there has to be an agreement there. There has to be an agreement that like this is the way we're going to educate, and then all of a sudden this person that has no background in that can come in and say, I don't think this deserves credit, or if they do have a background in education, what I always came up to when I was teaching in community colleges was that an administrator who had no background in composition and rhetoric, which was what I taught, they would look at my curriculum and say, "Well, I don't understand it." And I'm like, "Well, you're not in my class. Like that's fine. I don't need you to understand it just by looking at the syllabus. Like come to my class and you'll learn." But obviously they're not going to do that. And there just seems to be so many ties. We hear about the school to prison pipeline, but man, there's so many ties here. So okay, so Kevin, you mentioned your protest. There was I read an article before we got on about this protest. So you got some attention. That's good. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and put it into a little bit of context?
Yeah, so there's a group of us that kind of got together once the website formed. We had some people that actually had family members, because I have no tie to. There's no one in there that I know, and so mine is just purely from this is totally unconstitutional point of view to lock people up after they've served their time. But we have actually family members. Those family members started working on the protest and worked on it for some time. We were actually excited to have the media there because we had not had anyone really express any interest in. I mean, this is kind of the lost souls of the earth. No one wants to come out and have the appearance of supporting, people who have sexually offended. And that's not our point. Our point is not about supporting that. We don't support any crime at all, but we do support justice. And I think that was the whole idea of the protest, and to bring light to some facts that this for-profit company does what all for-profit companies do. They cut corners to make money. And so a perfect example of that is 3 of the 4 hospitals in this area will not treat them in for regular care, preventive care, because that company doesn't pay their bills on time. So they will only take emergency procedures. And I will say the fourth hospital didn't answer my questions because the attorney got involved. So I'm going to assume, from what we've heard, that the same is true for them, that the hospitals and doctors in this area will only treat them if they're in an ambulance. Well, by that time, when the average age of the men in this facility is 56 years old, many of them have spent decades in prison. Their health is not going to be great to begin with. They've not had good health care. There have been, to date, 26 men that have died since 2015. Now, Tico said in the article, and this goes back to the protest, that there have only been a few men that have died at the facility. Well, yeah, at the facility. But the care had gotten to the point where by the time they reached the hospital, there was nothing that they could do because of the preventive care. So, and right now, they say no one was released. All these men were released and in the community working in an outpatient program. So they weren't released from the program, but they were in the community being active and successful. These guys are locked up, and you are 4 times more likely right now to die in there than you are to get out.
Wow.
Just since 2015.
Wow.
If you look at the numbers, over 26 dead now, and 6 have been released that actually met the program requirements.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not hard to do the math. And these guys most of these guys are elderly because they've spent 20, 30 years in jail for the crimes they were heinous crimes. I'm not missing that at all. But if we let everyone else out that serves their time and say we can go on,
right?
And I'll go back to the criteria. The criteria in Texas, the language is so loose to identify these guys as people that will reoffend. That it's very easy to find a mental abnormality. ADHD is a mental abnormality. So, if you say, well, they're impulsive because they have ADHD and they can commit crime again, then there's check 1. Have they committed 2 or more offenses? Yeah, all of them have.
Yeah.
And that's why they were locked up.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, Janis, are you?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that one of the problems, so he's talking about the reporting and the statistics. One of the problems that we have, and this is not just in Texas, this is across the United States, is we have the federal data, then we have 50 different states that report, and there's no consistency across those systems. So that's 51 systems. Then add to that you have county, you have state jail, you have the system that he's talking about, you have the Department of Criminal Justice that most states have, like TDCJ. So do the math just on the number of systems, and there's no consistency across those systems on how data is even collected. So you can manipulate the numbers should you so want to manipulate the numbers, not that anybody in any position of power, say a privately owned system or anybody within the prison industrial complex. You can manipulate those numbers any way you need to.
Yeah. Well, and go ahead, Jason.
I was going to point out that if a mental health concern is part of it, lifetime prevalence of any mental health issue is just under 50%, according to JAMA. I mean, that's a standard statistic. About half of us at some point in our life have a major mental health challenge, which means about half of us could be subjected to at least one of the standards here. And I point that out to bring up the constitutionality issue that sometimes people care about.
Yeah.
Well, and just going back to the constitutionality, the idea that there is no definite, I mean, it's a lifetime sentence. It's a death sentence.
Yeah.
That there's no other way to put this. If the reason that they said they switched back to the inpatient facility in Littlefield was because no one was being released. Well, because they were worried about constitutionality cases coming up, saying, well, if you're not releasing anybody, then it's prison. That's not therapy. Well, now we've got 6 out of 450, not to mention the number that have died. Same thing. at some point this is constitutional again, because it's locked up if you're not releasing people.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you
Go ahead, Janis.
there's also the issue that once released, it's still a lifetime sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Because once released, regardless of your crime, you continue to be punished. It's punishment
Right.
following punishment,
Right.
for a variety of reasons, and that is true across the board. Especially true in the area that Kevin works in, but it's true across the board. Once you have a criminal background, you can't get a job. You can't live anywhere. You can't.
Yeah. Yeah.
The barrier.
Yeah. In Texas, you can't get a license. And so, when I was teaching, I know that some of my students went through programs, went through like EMT training programs, and they acted as EMTs in the prison. I remember very vividly, the first time I had a student have a seizure in my classroom. And fortunately, two of the students, they had their training. They jumped in. I actually, one student, because, when a student falls over in your class, I was at the desk in front and got up to do something. And one of the students threw her desk in front of me, because if I had touched this student who was now on the ground, they would have not let me back on campus. I couldn't do that. And so fortunately, those two students, had that training, were able to do that. But once they get released, they can't get a job in that area because they can't get that license. And so even sometimes the education that is provided, it can't be held. So I do like to focus on solutions. So Janis, we'll start with you, and then Jason, if you have ideas, and then we'll go to Kevin. But what are some of the solutions to these problems? What does our state need to do differently in order to drop recidivism? Recidivism is incredibly high, and the prison industry is really the only area where they can fail so much and not have anything happen to them. And so what do we need to do differently in order to fix this issue, Dr. Henderson?
I have to let this out here. It's maybe we need something like STAR testing for the prison system, and if the prison fails, we just close it.
There you go. Just close the prison.
Like, hey, your inmates are not getting what they need so that they can be released successfully. Sorry, we're gonna have to close you.
Yeah.
Or cut your funding by half. I think this is a great idea we can carry over from the wisdom of the education system.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And Jason, I just want to point out how horrified most people would be by that idea. Right. But right. I think that's a very good point.
Hey, if it works for our kids, if it works so well for our children, surely it will work for inmates.
Yeah.
It is a very valid statement.
Yes.
And when you asked about solutions, I was like, I don't even know which one to start with. Mm-hmm. I know that the statewide leadership council that I work with, we basically have about 8 systems that need rehabilitation to address the issues that we have. That's 8 different systems within the bigger system. So we're talking parole and probation and bail and the confinement conditions. There's so many. But bottom line is our money needs to be diverted from that prison industrial complex to prevention and to rehabilitation. So mental health care, we all know that mental health care is a crisis in our nation. I wished I had pulled up the numbers, but they're astronomical, and one of y'all may know what the number of people who are incarcerated currently that have a mental health issue that led to them being there or that became worse as a result of being there. My son went in at 17 with issues that I couldn't get diagnosed for a whole slew of reasons wrong with our system, and came out with worse mental health concerns than he went in with after 8 years, 17 to whatever 17 plus 8 is. So we need to divert funding to prevention and rehabilitation of mental health care. Our substance abuse programs, I don't know if y'all are familiar with harm reduction programs,
Mhm.
but harm reduction programs, social supports that are grounded in a strength orientation where we look at people's trauma and we understand what their trauma is. I can go on for a long time.
So why I think we know what harm reduction is, but for our audience, can you explain a little bit what that
Yes, and I
includes?
actually, let me pull it up because I actually put a definition of it so that I would get it right, because it's not an area that I have done work in. I'm just very familiar with. So it accepts that substance abuse and substance use is a part of our social reality. It works to minimize the harmful effects of substance abuse rather than ignore or condemn it. And it works to understand that there are varying degrees of use that can be appropriate with management strategies. So, where one person who has a substance use problem should not drink or do any substance, another who maybe had a very extreme problem, meth or something, might be best served by a use of a substance that is less concerning, um, because that helps them manage. It's one of the bases for legalized marijuana, is
Yeah.
because that actually is not really a gateway drug so much as it can be used as a management strategy. So harm reduction is just understanding that we have to change that paradigm of how we look at substance use.
Yeah. And I know that one when harm reduction is discussed, one of the more controversial aspects are safe use spaces where especially intravenous drugs, they can get things tested, make sure it's not, fentanyl, what they're using is what they think it is. They have, clean needles, so that we don't have that disease. And while that is very controversial, it's also the help and the support and the love they need to start turning that around. And one thing that shocked me when I was teaching in the prison, partly because I was 23 when I started teaching there. I had 30 women in the classroom with me. The average age, was probably around 40, and so it was just a very, I grew up a very conservative, sheltered Church of Christ kid. And so then suddenly I'm standing in front of these 30 women who have had very different lives than me. But what shocked me were the women who had developed substance abuse problems once they were in prison. And very specifically, one of the students, that I got to know, because as I was teaching for Central Texas College. I had no I've never taken an education class. I had no like classroom management skills, and so one of my students had been a second grade teacher for a long time, and so she would kind of help me and give me advice that I didn't get anywhere else. I really appreciated that. But she told me, she was in for what I would consider self defense. She killed her husband, and because Texas hates women, they first gave her 60 years to life. They did reduce it to 25, but she had been an elementary school teacher. She had lived a very similar life to what I had experienced, and then had this happen. Went into prison and developed substance abuse problems. She said, she said that she rarely drank. When before she went in, she had never tried any drugs. She hadn't even smoked, pot. And she was like, I've done everything. She said, once I got in, I've done everything. And she kind of had to deal with that substance abuse problem she developed in prison. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. Like, it's not as closed off as people think. Though, they might not be able to get out, but people can come in and bring stuff pretty easily. And so that always shocked me, that those problems could happen while in prison. And so I don't think we think about that either. Like, they could have new issues while coming out. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I think one of the reasons why those types of things are so prevalent, they call it juice. They make juice. And so alcoholism is a huge issue. But I think one of the main issues, and this is an area of that would be very important for reform is confinement conditions. If you look at the conditions of confinement, that's a double punishment. I sent Cannon some pictures yesterday of the food that is typically served while you're incarcerated. In one of there's an advocate that she served time in the Texas prison system. She's out now, and she's now a journalist, and she has connections that people send her pictures. And I don't know how she gets them. I don't ask questions. But the food that they're served is disgusting. And depending on what reports you read, there is less than $1,000 a year spent on each inmate on their food. Less than $1,000 a year for food. So if you're living with moldy bread, what are you going to do? You're going to do something to make yourself not feel so miserable. No air conditioner. 75% of Texas prisons don't have air conditioning. So I invite everybody to sit in a concrete block this summer on our hottest days. It's just basic human dignity is denied. So when they come out, what is your mindset? If you've been treated with a lack of basic human dignity, and that this goes back to what Kevin was talking about, the people he's talking about are being treated with less than human dignity. We don't treat prisoners of war that way.
Yeah. Well, and another thing, you're talking about the food and the health. What the women in my class would tell me is that on average, women who go into the Texas prison system gain 30 pounds while they're in prison because it's not healthy. They go between being worked in the fields until they're having seizures in my classroom to, being put in a cell and just sitting for most of the day. And what we don't think about, what people who have not had any experience with this, is that, they're given a change of clothes from the local Goodwill and $50 in a bus ticket. And if you have gained 30 pounds, in the last 10 years, you have no clothes. And so even if you have a home, even if you have people to go to, if you are having to start over, and those things can be so difficult. And I don't think we think about those little things, like simply having to buy an entire new wardrobe once you're out, and you haven't been making money. You're starting with zero. And so those little things along with that indignity, absolutely.
So my son, I mentioned that my son served 8 years. He was out for about 3 years. During that time period, he had a son, so I have a grandson. But he is back in for all of the typical reentry issues. When he comes out in less than 10 weeks, having served a 3-year sentence, he will have spent, because of COVID, he spent a longer time in county than he should have before he was transferred, which was a blessing. He will come out having spent a year of that time without his medications. He has schizoaffective disorder. He will have spent a year of that time without his medications. He will have spent 21 months of that time in solitary confinement.
Wow.
What is that going to be like for him on July 1st, when we pick him up? What condition is he going to be in? So to me, one of the places we start is changing what it's like to be in that experience.
Mm-hmm.
Decarcerate and don't send them there in the first place, especially youth. We have 6 or 20, I can't remember, I'm so bad with numbers, juveniles that are incarcerated with life without parole.
Yeah.
So stop sending our 17-year-olds to prison. So those are the two. Stop sending, and while they're there, treat them with dignity. Those are my top 2.
Okay. Jason, go.
Janis, I had a moment to look up, since we're on.
Can you get a little closer to your microphone, Jason?
Sure. Since we're on streaming, I had a moment to look up the stat you were looking for.
Yeah.
The American Psychological Association reports mental illness among inmates is at a rate of 64% in jails, which is generally a city or county, 54% of state prisoners, 45% of federal prisoners reporting mental health concerns in a report, in a study. So again, roughly half of folks, I mean, if you can imagine being in those conditions and not being somewhat depressed,
Right.
you're an unusual person, probably.
Yeah. I mean, it was hard to teach. I was just going there, 3 days a week, 3 hours, at a time, and would often leave depressed because it was hard. I cared about those students, and so, but Jason, how much? Okay, that probably how much is not a good way of phrasing that, but what part of what do we call criminal that's really mental health? Like how can we separate those two things and make this a better system? Is instead of criminalizing people with mental health issues, how can we do that? Where do we start? Is that too big of a question?
That's a huge question. I was going to approach the concept of criminality sort of globally. We tend to think of the criminal in with stereotypes, much in our ignorance primarily, where the stereotype is the psychopath that we've seen on CBS or on a movie,
Right.
and those are that's roughly 1% of the population, and they're among us. They're not. Some are in prison at a higher rate, fortunately, but not the vast majority of people. At least 90% by most estimates are nothing like psychopaths or rampant dangerous criminals that are in prison. They're folks who got caught using pot or some other substance. And typically substance use is to address some kind of intolerable emotion. It's really straightforward. So what you do is you lock up the people who are trying to cope with an intolerable emotion, spend an enormous amount of the federal, state, local budget on locking up people who are trying to cope with living, because living is a challenge, as everybody listening recognizes at some point your life will become overwhelming. Well, if you use a substance and get addicted to a substance to do that, and then your behavior goes haywire, you have a good chance you're going to be locked up, especially for a minority.
Yeah.
And so this idea that what we're going to do to fix the underlying coping with life challenges, punish them and humiliate them and beat them down into submission until they're good functional members of society. Like,
Right. Yeah.
that's the most, it's idiocy. It's absolute.
Yeah.
It's like if somebody actually proposed that, they wouldn't get elected. However, once they're elected, they can then propose that, and it makes people feel like, yes, tough on crime. Punish the people who are having trouble coping or who don't have skills to adapt to society. A thing that really drives me kind of crazy about this, having worked with tons of homeless people, I think I've worked more with homeless people than with incarcerated people. There's the notion that they made this choice. You'll hear it all the time. When you hear choice, this is just a hallmark for ignorance that you're hearing. They made a choice to live under that bridge and shoot up. No, actually, how many of us, raise your hand if your idea of a good time is shooting up under a bridge? That's 0% of the population.
Right.
0.0. They didn't make a choice to do that. They had a lack of other skills or opportunities, and they were buried by life circumstances. That's how it happened. It's not magic. It's complicated a little bit, but the notion that punishing them and humiliating them and degrading them until they become productive members of society is absolute. It's a huge waste of money for those who care about, who are conservative enough to care about an actual budget and how you run a government. That's the stupidest way to spend your money that you can possibly dream up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well, and talking about that, degrading them, and when I was teaching in Gatesville, so there's the Hughes unit, that's the one men's unit out there, that's maximum security. And then, now I'm forgetting what the maximum security women's unit was. But so I taught them 2 maximum security units, where I could not walk more than, 10 yards without having to go through another gate. And I was more scared of the guards than any of my students. Now, I understand the students I had, they were a very select group, in the prison. But at the same time, like you said, there's these stereotypes out there, and it wasn't what it was like, and the guards definitely like tried to degrade me as much as they could, and kind of show their authority over me. And one time the guard in the education unit just decided we didn't need more than one piece of paper per student. We were taking a test that day, and I was like, look, they're gonna write a lot. Like, we need at least five pages. And I kept sending students down. I was supposed to stay in the classroom with them, so I kept sending students down trying to get more paper. He wouldn't do it. I finally just walked down there. He was doing something else. I opened the drawer, got a package of paper out, walked back. He came in my classroom and said, you better hope none of them get mad at you, because I'm not coming here to help. And I was like, well, they're not. Like, that's like, you're the only one mad at me here. And so living like that day to day, yeah, I can't imagine mentally what you go through. So Kevin, what about you? What do you see that what are solutions to change recidivism and these issues we've talked about?
Well, I'm kind of like Janis on this. Where do you even begin? Because there's so many things that need to be done. But I'll go back to something Jason said, and I'm not making a plug for him for school board because I'm not in this district, but I would vote for him if I was. Just hearing some of the things he said today. But and former employee of Lubbock ISD, I might add. We should talk sometime. But here's the thing: when you don't live the life that some of these folks have lived, and you have the resources to get the mental health, you have the resources to get your kid what they need, you have the connections in the community to find out what's the best approach, what's the best plan of attack to help your family cope with life, then it's easy to sit on a high horse and say, thou shalt do this and thou shalt do that. When your perspective of life is based on the resources that you had growing up, that's the life you live. We live the life we know. And so I think that what Jason said is probably one of the most powerful things that people need to recognize when we serve other people. And that's school board members, that's people in advocacy, that's everywhere, is that we don't live the life they've lived. So number one, we've got to start with prevention. We've got to start with education. And I'm an educator, 24 years, 19 as a school principal. I teach adult GED. I'm about to be a regional manager for Head Start. Like, education is my thing. But I will tell you, without the education and the mental support, and I'm so glad that there's some things going on with social emotional growth and restorative discipline and those kinds of things. And I will say, Jason, I was the first principal in Lubbock to start restorative discipline and community circles and some of the social emotional growth. So I'm glad they've grown in that area. But it's not enough. It's not enough. So we've got to start with prevention. The second thing is, and in particular in this case with civil commitment, there's 20 states that do it and 30 that don't. How do 30 states effectively not do it and not have a problem with these, so-called monsters out on the street and recidivism, and 20 states decide to do it and make money off of it? That's one thing. And that's not so much a solution, but a comparison of how can one state make it work without it and other states not. And so I think it's important to see this goes back to what Janis is saying with consistency. You can't have 51 different systems and expect to get good data about what's actually going on or how to improve a system. And if we apply the STAR methodology that we talked about with, if you got a set of standards and you got to live by them, and this is what we're going to do to shut you down or keep you open, you can't do that if you have 51 different systems. And I would argue that that system is totally broken too, but that's a whole other discussion. So what I would say is that, first of all, prevention. Second, what are other states doing that don't require this? And third, if there is going to be this, assessment at the end of a 30-year sentence, why don't we do the assessment when they're convicted? Apply the treatment as soon as they start their incarceration, and do the mental health support while they're there. Why are we waiting until 30 years later and then we're going, hey, we're going to make money off of this? We're going to make a for-profit prison and hold these guys indefinitely because they have a mental abnormality. Guess what, folks? They had a mental abnormality when the crime was committed.
Right.
So why are we not offering these mental health supports and mental training and pro-social values and all of that cognitive behavioral thinking. Because right now I'm in a treatment facility for LCDC. And so these guys come in and it's therapeutic. It actually works. These guys get out in 9 months. They're reintegrated. They're reintegrated within the program. And guess what? They know it's 9 months unless they make unless they do some things that are stupid and then they get set back. But they know if I do the program and work it 9 months, I'm out. And I've got money in the bank because I was working before I left to save money. It works. We're the most successful program in the state for this kind of treatment. But the thing is, if you're not getting treatment before you get out, and then you get out and they say, oh, by the way, you have a mental abnormality and now you need treatment, it's the cart and the horse.
Yeah.
It's the cart and the horse, and it's money. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Yeah.
And Janis mentioned the prison industrial complex. This is no different. It's another way to make more money with a different twist.
Yeah.
So the solution is prevention.
Yeah. And the other thing I almost mentioned this earlier and then we moved on, but so teaching, in these maximum security prisons in Gatesville, I would tell people these prisons were like every prison movie you've seen. Like it is cinder block walls. It is but then I taught at a medium security private prison in New Mexico. And that was the scariest place I ever taught because they were understaffed. I would get locked in my room or my hallway sometimes because they wouldn't have the guards they needed. And so I was supposed to, I taught a class at 8 a.m. at the prison. I had a 10 o'clock class or so, like there was a little bit of time, but I had a 10 o'clock class on campus. One time I got locked inside because they were doing a drill and they just didn't bother to look at the log and see if there was anybody in there. And so I was stuck in the prison for 3 hours because they didn't bother to look. And my dean and department chair on campus knew I wasn't there, but didn't think, should we call the prison and see if they've locked him inside?
Well,
go ahead, yeah.
No, I'd say two things about that with the Civil Commitment Center in Littlefield because of their turnover rate. Right now, they have 3 therapists for 458 men because of the turnover. Everybody's leaving. Nobody's staying. Or they're firing them because they actually realize they care about the men and they don't want that.
Yeah.
We want you to beat them down, tear them up, hold them back, keep them from moving ahead.
Right.
And if you don't do that, which is unethical to say the least, if you don't do that, then you're not the right fit for us.
Right.
So right now they've got 3 therapists. So they have a former educator, and I'm not knocking educators because I am one, but they have a former educator making packets of work for them to do that they're calling treatment. Well, first of all, not clinical therapist, an educator. So it's no worse than the STAR packets that kids come home with. That's drill and kill. There's no engagement. It's not authentic. It's not going to help them with pro-social behaviors or help them in treatment. It's to keep them busy because we don't have enough therapists because we can't keep them on staff. Yeah. And then we have an issue with the guards. Sometimes guards are covering 2 and 3 buildings. Well, when they're out of that building, it's locked down. There was a fire in a building the other day because of an overhead light. And if the guard hadn't been there and had been floating around like they have been, those men would have been locked in with a fire, no way to get out. Wow. And these guys are in wheelchairs and walkers, a lot of them. So you're not talking about a rapid fire drill exit here,
right?
In the under 3 minutes that the fire department would require. So you bring up a really good point with the staffing issue that, for these private companies, like you were saying, they are the worst. Because again, the less people I have to pay, the more money I make.
Yep.
Well, and
absolutely.
It's really sad.
Staffing is a concern. Well, it's a concern in all of our industries and jobs. In the last couple of years, we've got staffing shortages across the board. But staffing has always been a shortage issue within the system. And so now it's at an all-time high. And then we have things like $254 million of TDCJ funds were redirected to the border wall over the
Right.
period of 5 months last year. So it's prioritizing these issues once they're there. And again, back to what I think it was Kevin who said, preventive measures to help us move out of thinking that this is our only solution. That this is incarceration is the only solution.
I wanted to quickly interject that that same mentality of taking a business approach to prisons should never, ever, 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 ever be discussed in the realm of education, where students are a product and you're supposed to minimize the cost and maximize the output of students.
Absolutely.
A business approach to teaching is not teaching.
Right.
Just want to put that out there.
And I would even add to that anything that's therapeutic or educative in any nature should never have that attached to it, because you're not going to get the kind of quality that you need from it, because the products that you're producing, if we truly believe, and this is the big sticking point for me, that humans are redemptive, that people should have a second chance, that if the justice system is designed to provide just that, justice and an opportunity to be redeemed or be redeemable, then you cannot put a price on that or manage it in a business model and expect to have the output that you want for, kids coming out with a quality education, or men and women coming out of the criminal justice system feeling redeemed and whole, versus torn down and picked apart.
Yeah. Well, and Kevin, so Janis, we're going to wrap up. So I'll let you get one more comment, then I'll ask my last question.
Okay. So, he made me think about one of the number one things that we know give people a reason to go on is hope.
Yep.
And what we're not doing is giving any hope. We are removing hope.
Yeah. Which brings me to my last question, which is, what gives you hope? And so Janis, why don't you take that on first? What gives you hope? It can be about this or about anything else.
I think that we're moving more into preventive models as a society in other areas. So I think that, and I am a prevention educator. And so I think that is becoming more normalized. And so I think we'll see it coming into the justice system as well. We have, because of the ACEs studies, the adult adverse childhood experience studies, we know the important roles of trauma. We now have, what has always bothered me about the ACEs and the trauma-informed work is that people do not pay enough attention to the other side of that coin, which goes back to hope. But the protective strengths that we each have. And no matter what your situation is, there is something that is a protective strength. There's research out of Oklahoma that I'm so excited about. I fangirl over them because it's PACEs, so it's protective compensatory experiences. And so those kinds of things give me hope. And we're starting to see, as far as like with reentry, we're starting to see programs like Ban the Box, where they're taking the box off of your employment applications where it asks about your criminal history. And there's beginnings to be talk of removing the box, ban the box for housing as well. So I don't think there's much movement on that, but it's at least being talked about. So I think that awareness, societal awareness, is becoming greater, and I think we can thank the Black Lives Matter movement and to a great deal. So I think we're moving the right direction. We just have a lot to do.
Yeah. Kevin, what about you? What brings you hope?
Well, a couple of things, and maybe this is the kind of a weird approach, but squeaky wheels get oil. And we have been squeaking, and we have made some progress in certain areas. So the men were charged a 25% tax on top of any gifts or things that they received from their family. So if their family sent them a new pair of jeans, they had to pay a 25% tax on the total cost of the jeans. So they've now reduced that or taken it away completely if it's from a spouse or family member. And that seems small, but these guys are not, it's a lot, especially
Right.
if they're, indigent. And so, and I feel like we hear from inside from the men that they feel like there's changes made, or at least the organization as a whole is kind of on alert to watch what they do and say, because they know that we're out here advocating for them. So that gives me hope, knowing that they know there's somebody out here that's at least trying to give a voice to some of the things that they're going on. And then what really gives me hope is that I believe that people are redeemable, that I believe that humans don't set out to have a crappy day or a crappy life, that they really want good things for themselves and for their families and for the people around them. Do people make mistakes and do stupid stuff? Yes. Do they do some things that do some lasting harm that may never go away for others? Absolutely. But I believe in all of that. Nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, how can I really, really screw up my life? Just believe that people have good in them and that we're redeemable.
Yeah. And Jason, what about you? What gives you hope?
So to be honest, I'm not an overwhelmingly hopeful person in regard to these size social issues. I think that if there's a silver lining, it's that I believe there is a slow and steady increase in public knowledge about major social issues, such as justice in general, such as mental health in general, that's creeping forward. On the less hopeful side, it's not creeping forward at a rate I think will overcome the profit motive of lobbyists. And so that's why my hope is at least very tempered, shall we say.
Fair enough. So Jason, tell our audience, like, if people want to learn more about your campaign and support and help, how can they find out? Where can they go to find out about that?
I have a Facebook presence. It's Rinaldo Lubbock. You can email me. That's the most direct way. I love talking to people. I have no shortage of words or ideas or resources, thoughts that I've written, and I'd be happy to share. Rinaldo Lubbock at Gmail. You can just email me directly, and I'd love to hear from folks.
All right, Kevin, where can we find out more about the TACC?
So we actually have a website, TexansAgainstCivilCommitment.com. I know that's long, but it wasn't taken, and so it's TexansAgainstCivilCommitment.com. We are also on Facebook as TACC, Texans Against Civil Commitment, and Twitter, TACC, Texans Against Civil Commitment. So you can find us on Twitter and Facebook, and also our webpage. I'm on Facebook, Kevin Word. You can reach out to me there too. We do have a petition out with change.org, and so if you're interested in looking that up too, it's shutting down the shadow prison, and so you can look for that on change.org and sign our petition. We're up to about 3,800 signatures, I think. So.
Okay, cool. And Janis, you mentioned a couple of groups, so you can plug whichever one or all of them. How do we find out more about the work you're doing?
Well, I would recommend that anybody who is interested look up the Statewide Leadership Council. You can find that on Facebook. They post about several different issues. Right now, a big thing that they're focused on is the execution issue for that's coming up this next week. Oh my goodness, yes, next week. I'm also on Facebook. I think I may still be showing that I live in Austin. So if it says Janis Henderson in Austin, that's me. I may try to remember to go on there and change it to Lubbock, since that's about 2.5 years out of date. But yeah, they can, those are the two main things that ways to probably get more information. And if you are interested, there is an organization called Texas Inmate Families Association, TIFA, and Lubbock does not have a chapter for it. And I would like to start a chapter. So if I had known about it when my son went in at 17, I think it could have made a big change for me. So if somebody's interested in that, I definitely would ask that they look me up on Facebook and send me a private message to express interest, because it's just social support for people who have people that are incarcerated. And so I would love to see Lubbock get a chapter.
Awesome. And we'll leave it there. I want to thank my guests for coming on. I really appreciate them for having this discussion. This can be a hard topic to discuss because this is a group of people that society says we shouldn't care about. And so it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to discuss. And I think we had a really productive conversation. And like my guest said, if you are wanting to get involved in this kind of advocacy work, look up their organizations, contact them. There are plenty of people who need this help in West Texas. I appreciate you joining us, and I'll see you next week.